Hello, and welcome to Books in the World. I'm your host, Kathleen Murphy. Books in the World is an interview show produced by the Cape Cod Writers Center and the Cape Media Center. Our goal is to show how writers, illustrators, publishers, editors, and others in the literary field play their role in the world of books and other communication media. The Writers Center was established 58 years ago and sponsors a 4-day writers conference every summer right here on Cape Cod. Books in the World has been broadcasting continuously for over 40 years. Today we are delighted to welcome Paul Clerici and talk about his book, Born to Coach, the story of Bill Squires, the legendary coach of the greatest generation of American distance runners. Paul has covered running and the Boston Marathon for over 30 years. He's a journalist, a photographer, and an award-winning former newspaper editor and sports editor. He's published articles in national and international magazines and is often a guest lecturer and historian on television and radio. He is director of the Walpole, Massachusetts-based Cami 5K Run and David 5K Walk, an annual race begun in 2001. He has personally competed as a runner in nearly every distance, from the mile to the marathon. He's competed in 2 triathlons and 43 marathons, including running the Boston Marathon 23 times. Other books by Paul Clerici include Images of Modern America, the Boston Marathon History by the Mile, History of the Greater Boston Track Club, and A History of the Falmouth Road Race. Paul brings his expertise to today's book, Born to Coach, an authorized biography about the legendary Bill Squires. Every page in this book is so rich. It's almost a masterclass in how to distill the essence of a vital and amazing life into 300 pages. Often using Coach Bill Squires' own words, Paul draws a vivid picture of Bill's personal life and his coaching life. In the process, he reveals insights on why his athletes were so successful and especially why Coach Squires was so beloved. So Paul, I'm so thankful that you're here with us today. Welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
So let's start with, what was the genesis of this biography? When did you decide to write it?
I actually wrote a story about Coach in Marathon and Beyond magazine that came out prior to the book, and he really liked that. I interviewed him. I had known him for a number of years, Coach Squires, and I interviewed him for the magazine, and he said this is the first story that really captured him his entire life. He had stories written about him a lot, little pockets here and there, but Marathon and Beyond magazine was a magazine you could really delve into your stories, really long stories. Yeah. So he liked that idea, and then he's thinking, it'd be nice to tell my full story.
Yeah.
Wow,
so he kind of...
Yeah, he's like, he read that, he said, that'd be kind of nice.
Wow.
To get all that. He goes, while he was training athletes, he didn't want to give away any secrets.
Yes.
Because he didn't want any other runner to beat his runners with his own methods. Right. So he goes, it's time, I think I can talk about it now, which was kind of neat. So I said, well, let me do some research and, let's get it, really delve into it. Because I said, this won't just be a running book. I go, this will be your life. So to really delve into it, in warts and all. And he said, okay, let's do something like that.
Wow, it's like a peek behind the curtain. I noticed when you said that he was very secretive. During his years of competing and during his years of coaching, he was very, very secretive about the things that he did. So he was a bit of a mystery. So I love that you got a peek behind the curtain and thus gave it to the rest of us.
Well, it was interesting. Everyone joked with him that he always wrote down little programs on the back of a napkin or a piece of paper or an envelope or something. And his runners would always say, why don't you just write it on a nice big piece of paper? And he goes, no, this is fine, what I have right here. He never told anyone. He goes, I didn't want my whole program on a big piece of paper for anyone to see. Right. He'd be at the Elliott Lounge with Tommy Leonard, behind the bar, and Coach would have his own seat, Coach's Corner. And people would come in and he'd hold court and talk about everyone. He would show you what to do. He loved it. He just loved the sport. But he didn't want to put it all in one spot.
Right.
So if you came up to him and say you didn't know him and you came up to him and said, hey, coach, I do this and this. What do you think? He'd go, yeah, hold on a second. He'd grab a napkin or a scrap of paper and jot down, do this, this, and this. This is good for your track.
Yeah.
And you would take that. But he didn't want to get in the whole thing. So for the book, I wrote it in such a way that, the runners and track nerds, as we say, would love the real deep, the minutiae of a training program. I didn't get too much into it throughout the whole book, but enough that to satisfy them. Yeah, really good details.
Yeah.
And then for people who maybe didn't know about Coach, because I joked with him, he did too good a job staying in the background, because he would promote his athletes and talk about them prior to a race with the media and stuff. Not a lot to put a mark on their back, but he would for the competitors. But he would talk about them. But then he said, once the race ended, it's their time now. I'll stay in the back because it's for them. And I said, we did too good a job because I couldn't find a lot of stuff during research. But I knew him enough what to get from him. But you're right, he was kind of like a mystery to a point. Like everyone knew him in the sport. And I've talked to runners who weren't even born when he was doing this, and they knew him. They loved him. They want to meet him. I've been to events with him, and it's just great to see him getting the attention and the accolades I think he should have got decades ago from other people outside the world of running. So it's nice.
From reading your book, I totally agree. I feel like you gave this guy, he's kind of an unsung hero. He was very selfless, and he really pushed his athletes, especially, well, all of his athletes, from the beginning to the elite athletes.
Yeah.
He really, really pushed them. So let's get into that. So Coach Squires, he had a decades-long career. He progressed from coaching young people up to post-collegiate athletes, and then he brought this expertise along with his considerable enthusiasm for the sport, to elite athletes at the Greater Boston Track Club. So tell us about some of these athletes that he worked with and their accomplishments.
Yeah, he accumulated all this because he went to school at Notre Dame, and he was an excellent runner at Notre Dame. Excellent runner at Arlington High School as well. And he learned from his coaches, and he learned from other runners. He learned from his ability as well. And he kept that, because I asked him, when did you really think you were going to coach? And he said, I don't know, but I always have that in my head of knowing what to do, how to do it. Because I always just sort of knew. And then, like at Greater Boston Track Club, he knew some runners who got the training. Like some runners would do what he told them to do, which was fine. But some knew the overall picture. And he goes, yeah, he'll be a coach. So when Coach was in the Army, as an example, after Notre Dame, he was stationed in Stuttgart, Germany, and he made a point to go to England, to Paddington Ground, and he found Derek Ibbotson, the British Olympian, and learned from him something, ran with him and trained with him a little bit, about a week or so, but enough that he went there for a purpose, and they appreciated it, and he learned from that. And then as he started coaching high school athletes, he started to apply what he learned as a runner and as a coach. Then when he did in the collegiate level, he turned it up a notch for the older people. So then when Greater Boston began, Jack McDonald at Boston College in 1973, here are post-collegiate guys who are good, they've been coached well. Now Coach Squires can take them to the next level based on what he had learned. So he formed everything. And by the time, even in high school, he did group, he would coach, he would put athletes in different groups, group 1, group 2, group 3, based on your ability. But he said everyone got the same program, but depending on your ability. The group 1 guys were the faster ones, group 2 was the next level, and so on. So he developed that over years. So when Greater Boston Track Club came, he had guys like Bill Rogers, Alberto Salazar, Greg Meyer, Bob Hodge, I can go on, Randy Thomas, Dick Mahoney.
So just to remind people that are watching, so Bill Rogers won the marathon.
Yeah, Bill Rogers ended up winning Boston Marathon 4 times, U.S. Olympian. He won New York 4 times. Alberto Salazar won Boston, New York, set the records. Greg Meyer won Boston in '83. Basically, every American who won the Boston Marathon in the 70s and 80s was from Greater Boston Track Club and or coached by Bill Squires.
Right.
Jack Fultz won in '76 and ended up being coached a little bit with Coach afterwards. But all the Americans. And what he did was basically Coach employed this group, like what the Kenyans have been doing, this group training together. And they would push each other. Now, Salazar came from Wayland High School, so he was a younger kid when he joined Greater Boston Track Club. So his training was targeted for a high school kid, but he was so good. He was Group 1. But they would train together. They had this thing called car tag, which Greg Meyer loved. And you'd have the Bill Rogers and Greg Myers, all these guys running. Can you imagine on a Sunday morning seeing everyone run, the running boom starting in the 70s?
Yeah.
And they're running along the marathon course, and Coach Squires would say, okay, start at like a 5-minute pace. I will be in my car somewhere up ahead, either a half mile ahead, 3/4 of a mile, somewhere. When you see me, I'm going to scream out a time, a pace. You do that pace. Yeah. And I'll do that again and again. He's replicating what happens in a marathon, where you change your pace, you do your intervals. So they'd be running 5-minute miles, and then and they wouldn't know the distance. The runners wouldn't know where Coach would be. So Coach, like 3/4 of a mile, would yell out, all right, 450. So the runners would go 450 until they would see Coach again at maybe a half mile, whatever. They loved that because it really worked on you. And it was on the course too with the hills. And it's interesting because that's what the Kenyans do and a lot of the athletes do as a group, that you'll see running together. And then as you get closer to the finish, you'll start to see a few of them, it's just their day. But you'd use the hills because they started at Boston College as their training, and they'd go out on the course.
Right.
But they were famous for using the hills, like the Newton Hills. There's flats in between each hill. And you would see Bill Rogers do this a lot. And what they would do is say you're approaching the hill, mile 17 in Newton, and there's a couple of guys on Bill Rogers' shoulder, their first, second, third. Bill would run up the hill at your normal pace, because as Coach said, you can't beat the hill. But on the flat, Bill Rogers would just go. Take off until he gets to the next hill and then go back to that hill pace. The runner off his shoulder will go, I got to catch up to Bill. By the time he figures it out, has to use the incline to catch up to Bill. You do that 3 or 4 times, you just grind those guys' legs. By the time you get to Boston College on the other side of Heartbreak Hill, Bill Rogers, Greater Boston guys, Greg Meyer, by using that process, shredded the guy. Gelino Bordin did that from Italy in 1990. He was about 2.5 minutes behind Emu Yukanga in mile 17. And Bordin knew about the Italian hills and how to train, and he did the same kind of thing. And by the time they got to BC, I think they were shoulder to shoulder, and Bordin just sort of wore down Yukanga and ended up winning.
There was a couple of years when the people that were successful in the Boston Marathon, most of them were from the Greater Boston Track Club, had been coached by Bill Squires, that the statistics that he got, the winning statistics that he got, actually beat most countries.
Yes. You imagine that? The big example is 1979 Boston Marathon. 4 of the top 10 finishers were from Greater Boston Track Club.
That's amazing.
So that beat other clubs, countries, and that happened routinely.
So in other words, we're talking about a coach that not only helped his runners succeed, they succeeded better than most countries.
Yes.
If not all.
Yes.
Right?
Can
because of the numbers that he came up with.
Yeah, in that peak like that. Yeah. And what's interesting is that, and I love this aspect of coaching, he does too, some of the runners he coached became coaches.
Yeah.
And then their runners incorporated a lot of that. And then it's like generationally, because, as you go on and on, that's a legacy. Awesome. That is, how do you replicate something like that? It's awesome. And they're not going to do everything Coach says, but they build upon that, because that's what Coach Squires built upon his coaching. He's coached by Olympians, and then added his, and then so he had a few, one of them in particular, Bob 70, ended up coaching Joan Benoit Samuelson. Wow. So take it from there. So it's an interesting thing like that, where it just goes on, and you want that. I mean, because Coach Squires loved the sport, gave back as much as he could, so he loved that.
So you did a great job of showing so incredibly successful later in life, but you did a great job of showing the contrast between his early life, where he was ill and very isolated as a child, and then he becomes this fierce competitor in Notre Dame, and he becomes this inspirational coach. Yeah. So what did he learn from those experiences as being a very ill
Yeah, that surprised me at the success he had as a runner. He came from good stock with his parents, as he said. When you start something, finish it. But he was born with a malformed heart. One of his heart valves is the size of like a pinpoint, very small. So he was born in 1932, so back then they didn't really know what that meant. So his formative first few years, they said, don't do any exercise. We don't want to stress the heart, because they didn't know what it was. He actually remembers overhearing conversations doctors had with his mother saying he's not going to get to be a teen, not to live that long. They finally found a doctor, I mean, to the point that like the mother had to push him in a baby cart way beyond being a baby. His feet were dragging on the ground. He couldn't play with the kids. He's really isolated in his room, homeschooled back then, missed a couple years, you know, and things like that. So it's very impressionable, obviously. It was tough. Finally, a doctor said, sort of diagnosed it correctly and said, no, get some exercise, build up that heart. Now, by that point, 3 of the 4 valves were normal. The fourth valve is still a pinpoint. You couldn't fix that, but you could build up that heart. And he said, once I was given that, I felt, and I named one of the chapters, I think, I felt like I could fly. Yeah. He goes, they'd open up this whole new, I ran. We lived on a hill, Arlington, always hills. Then he started running, playing football, playing hockey, just did all these sports. In addition to like the old adolescent kid things, just playing around, he broke his nose. He's legally blind in one eye because they jumped on 2x4s at a house that was being built in a neighborhood, just playing around, and a 2x4 came up, broke his nose, legally blind in one eye. He's broken his shoulder. During scouts in the woods, he was cutting trees with an axe, and he cut his ankle, really severely enough.
And that affected his running
And
style.
that affected his running, that he couldn't really wear new shoes because they were pressed. Yeah. All of that. And then by the time he was at Notre Dame, he broke and set about 24 records in the mile, the half mile, 3/4 mile, with all of that he had. I mean, and he did multiple events in each meet, in most meets, to the point that when he did like 3 or 4 events where he'd run in the same meet, like the half mile, the mile, 2 mile, and relays, that he would taste blood. You wouldn't see it, but because it was the only 3 of the valves are really pushing it, and your heart rate's going when he's pushing hard. With all of that, look at what he's accomplished. As a runner, I'm not even talking as a coach, as a runner.
Yeah.
That alone, if that's all he did, is remarkable enough.
Yeah, exactly. And a book could have been written just about that.
Just for that.
Right.
Of that story, of just for that. And Notre Dame, top Division I, he was on suspension for sophomore year cross country because he couldn't keep his grades up. It was overwhelming with him. It was so much. He had to get a tutor and everything because he was behind educationally from school. Right. So in addition to all of that, he's at the top echelon of a Division I school at an education. Because as an athlete, you have to get a higher grade than the regular students. Right. So like I'm saying, in addition to all of that, each level he had conquered. You know, like his father, like he says, my parents said, you start something, you finish it. And he would do that. And so just, again, as a human being and as a runner, he did all of that.
Incredible.
But then he applied that as a coach too, which you saw the efforts of that coming out in all the success.
Right. So he married right after college, and then he quickly got drafted into the Army. And it was when he was in the Army that he got his first taste of coaching. So he'd had all these successes in college, hard won, and he makes it through college, but then he goes into the Army and he gets some more exposure to coaching there. His first time.
Yeah, that was Derek Ibbotson, because as he was coached in Notre Dame, it's a different mentality in college because you go for points so the team can win. And he was coached a little differently. That some of the things he was doing at Notre Dame, the other athletes couldn't keep up because he was that much better. So he learned from that and said, you should approach this a little differently than just the way I was. And you go, and he ended up talking to the coach afterwards, and he goes, yeah, I should have done this and this, but you're in the moment. So he learned from that. He coached a little bit at William and Mary when he was in the service, and then when he went to Paddington Grounds, as I said, with Derek Ibbotson, he really learned about what the difference between what the Europeans do season-wise and what the Americans do, because we go in indoor track, cross country, indoor track, outdoor track. He goes, they have different peaks in their seasons in England, different mileages. It's different. So he learned. This was in the 50s. So he learned from that. So he incorporated that when he came back, and then when he ended up going overseas in the 70s as part of the U.S. State Department, coaching coaches from India and different countries.
You tell some lovely stories.
He brought that to that as well because he knew. He goes, no, I remember how I felt as a runner, being either overcoached, undercoached, or whatever it was. I'm going to be a little more, take it to the next level and treat the athletes a little differently to see what works, because one size doesn't fit all.
No.
So he learned that as well. And by the time, like we were saying earlier, by the time I got to Greater Boston, he really had a good formation that the Greater Boston Track Club athletes, no pun intended, hit the ground running with his program.
Right.
And then he would tweak here and there of what the athletes he got. But he had a good group from doing it at Arlington and doing it at Boston State College. So he progressionally really formed that training. And he had a good, he could just look at a runner and analyze the gait and know. So he did have that innate ability to do that.
What I liked, another contrast that you brought out about Coach Squires is that in all of this learning, he became very serious about the way that he instructed his athletes and the mechanics of coaching itself. But he also very much valued joking and laughing and practical jokes and keeping his athletes comfortable as much as he could. So maybe you could share an example of this.
Yeah, he was great. He said, this is hard. He goes, all the other sports are fun. You hit a ball, you kick a ball, you play. This is hard. Yeah. You're running on your own. Yeah. Who are you going to impress until you get to the race? He goes, so I try to make it fun. And he had a great sense of humor, very dry wit. It was really, really funny. And I remember Greg Meyer, who won Boston 1983, always joked that coaches are type, why use 10 words when you can use 20? That was another thing. But he'd be at Boston College during the old track, and he'd be like reading the newspaper, as he's giving everyone the intervals and track work to do. And they're thinking that he doesn't know what he's doing or is not paying attention. And like the corner of his eye, he'll say, I said, finish your 220. They're not realizing he could kind of like see the far corner of the track. They were just sort of, But they respected him. They didn't joke around, but they, joke around. They respected him. They knew he knew what he was doing. Yeah. And Coach always said, everything I give you, I can do or have done. And sometimes they pushed him and go, really? And he said, let's go. And he would run alongside with them, or he would do that, which was kind of funny. But he would he's almost like a Forrest Gump in that he would just stumble upon things. He was training his guys at Franklin Park. I think it was the Boston State guys. And he looks over and he sees 3 or 4 black gentlemen. One is a black tie. 3 of them are wearing like a black suit, tie, very stern, and one is in like a hooded gray sweatsuit with boots and everything. And he walks up, and one of the gentlemen says, "Hey, Coach or Bill, it's Lewis Walcott." And he goes, "Oh, you're the 3/4 mile from whatever." I forget where he went. It was Louis Farrakhan with Muhammad Ali, getting ready to fight up in Maine. And he goes, I want Muhammad to talk to you, who just changed his name from Cassius Clay, about some training and boots and everything. So Coach kept calling him Cassius because he just changed his name. And he goes, it's Muhammad. He goes, I'm sorry. He goes, it's okay. So he starts talking to Muhammad Ali. All the athletes come around and go, do another loop. He goes, okay. He's talking to Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam and Muhammad Ali in the middle of Franklin Park. And he was invited to see the fight, but he couldn't because of training. He's bringing his guys back from a race in New York, and they always go to a diner. And they went to some restaurant, and Diane Carroll, the actress, was performing later that night. It was a diner. And she was a couple of tables up, which the athletes didn't see. So they just won a medal in one of the events. So Coach goes to the bathroom, sees Diane Carroll and says, could you wave to my guys? They just won this. And they did a couple of tables away. She goes, I'll come over, honey. Grabs his hand. So the athletes are looking up, and they see Coach Squires walking, escorting Diane Carroll, a famous actress, arm, and she's talking to everyone. They're like, Coach, how do you find these people?
And he just walked from one situation into another and just,
But he's so open to that, and he's very, charming and inviting and happy that he's open to things like that. Because some people just walk by Ali or walk by Diane Carroll if you're not paying attention. He loves life, and he would see things like that, or as they would go through the toll booth, they didn't have enough money back then. They'd find change on the ground and throw it in there. Or they would split mattresses at a hotel, kind of thing. And him and 2 athletes would come into the lobby to the hotel to get the room. Everyone else would be in the car in the back. So they pay for one room. They split the mattress. And then afterwards, he said, everyone forgets their clothing. So they're all in the lobby. I go to the room. I come down. I'm wearing like 3 ties, 5 hats, and 4 jackets going, I'm ready. Let's go, guys. That's my jacket. Oh, that's my hat. It's mine now. So,
So
he kept it light.
Yeah, he kept it light, he kept it joking, but he was mothering them in a lot of
Yeah.
ways too. I mean, he was kind of he was watching out for everything. You know, their lives, their running, everything.
Because you know how it was as a runner
Yeah.
and as a coach. So he was good in both areas of that, you know. And a lot of the kids are still young.
Yeah.
When you come out of college, you're in your early 20s or something, you're still a kid, so to speak. So, and you group together, so you get any parent knows, you get a bunch of kids together and it's trouble.
Yeah.
So you get these guys together, you know, it's like, oh, okay, I got to deal with 10, 12 kids again.
Yeah.
You know.
He's, you know, he's just going to, I hope that a lot more people read this book because it's such a great thing to honor someone who was so selfless.
Yes.
Someone who really gave of himself, of his professional skill, and just really nurtured these incredibly successful people, and then goes on and becomes a coach to and fosters the growth of all these other coaches. And those coaches beget other coaches.
Great?
It's wonderful. It's wonderful, and that he was the root of it, the start of it it's just
And it started
so
before
impressive.
him.
And it started before
think
him,
about it.
but he
He's
had his
part
own
of that.
unique.
Yeah.
The way that you wrote this, you really get this sense of what a character he was and how memorable he was. You know?
Yeah, that's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun.
Which
And he's
I-
still like that too, which is great. I mean, he just has that. He's just got twinkle in the eye. I always said the fox that bit me died. He just has that twinkle in the eye, and you're like, okay, where's he going with this? Where, you know, and then the stories. I mean, like Coach's Corner at Elliott Lounge, the old Elliott Lounge. Like
Oh,
I'd say.
we don't have time.
I
for
know,
it.
but
I would love it.
but he would regale it. He would just tell the stories. What I'm
Yeah.
saying. He would just be sitting there, and if you ever wanted a couple of training things or a story,
Yeah.
with Tommy Leonard saying, pick something, and he would just, you know,
Yeah.
80 Olympics or this Olympics or whatever, and I'll tell you about it. And he would just go on a story.
I definitely
Yeah,
want to get
so
into
it was really neat.
Yeah, I want to get into the Elliott Lounge and see Coach's Corner. I think that would be really
Yes.
fun. So you have other projects that you're working on. We just have like less than a minute. So how do we find you?
The website is paulclerici.com.
Okay.
And on there I have pages for all the books that I've written, any appearances that I have, stories that I've written in magazines,
Very good.
road races and things like that. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you so much for being on the
appreciate it.
show today. I wish we had
Thank
more
you.
time to talk about
this-
them. Please get this book. If you want to learn about running or coaching or just being a better person in general, read this book. It's very, very good. Thank you so much for watching Books in the World.